Let's go over all the external buttons and ports so you know exactly what each does, and you will know what I'm talking about in later lessons. The most important button on your camera is the shutter button, and as on most cameras, this is a two-phase button, meaning it has two depths of activation. The first is a halfway depression, which you are going to feel as a spongy resistance. This is going to focus the image depending on where your focus square is on your viewfinder or your monitor. Pushing it down all the way is going to take the picture. I cannot stress how important it is to train your finger to know the physical feeling between these two positions, because it is the difference between focusing and shooting within just a couple millimeters. This is also critical when you need to get focus lock and recompose and then shoot. We will talk much more about this later on. I'm just saying, take the time to train your finger to know the difference between these two positions. On the top of the camera, we have the mode dial. It is going to allow us to control how our camera behaves when we change our settings. We'll be talking about this much more later. To the right of the mode dial, we have a small rotating wheel right above where our right thumb would rest. This is our control dial. I like to refer to it as the primary selector, and it will allow us to change our shutter speed, our aperture, depending on what mode we are in. In the manual mode, it is going to change your aperture. On the back of the camera, there is a wheel, which I like to call the multi-selector because of the many ways it works. When you rotate it, by default, it will act as the primary exposure control as well. However, in manual mode, rotating this wheel will change your shutter speed. Something that is easy to miss at first glance is that this rotating wheel can also be pushed directionally. So up, down, left, or right, in order to change different settings, to navigate the menu options, move around on a zoomed image, things of that nature. This is going to be very useful when going through the menu and making different choices. When you are in a shooting mode, meaning you can see your subject in the viewfinder or monitor right before you take the shot, this directional pad will allow us to select different features, and you probably also notice these icons. For example, if we want to change our ISO, we would press to the right, which would open the ISO selection menu, and then we can navigate by rotating or pressing directionally on our wheel. If we want to change our shooting drives, which is what the camera does after we press the shutter button down all the way, it can be a single shot, a burst, a timer, we would press to the left and then make our selection. Pressing down will allow us to access our exposure compensation for the P, S, and A modes, as well as the manual mode when auto ISO is selected. Moving that tick mark in those modes to the right will brighten our image, and to the left it will darken our image, and this is reflected in the monitor preview. I'll go into much greater detail on this in another lesson. Pressing up repeatedly allows us to toggle through different monitor display options. In the middle of this wheel, there is a selection button, and this acts as an enter or a return button when we navigate menus. In a shooting mode, this button acts as our auto focus square selector, which allows us to control where our camera is focusing. I'll go into much greater detail on this in our focusing lesson. I can pretty much promise you are going to use these buttons more than any others. Let's take a look at some of the other secondary buttons. To the right of the shutter button, we have the C1 button, and the garbage button is also the C2 button. C stands for customizable. The default of these buttons when you get the camera are C1 will select your focusing modes, C2 is our white balance control. I will be showing you how to customize these a little later on in another lesson. Around the shutter button, we have the power switch to turn the camera on or off. The button next to where our right ring finger would rest is the lens release button. We're going to push this every time we want to take a lens off of the camera body. In the middle on the top of our camera, we have a force flash button. This will allow a very small pop-up flash to activate and can provide some very limited fill. To the right of that, we have the deep menu button. We're going to have a huge lesson on the deep menu, dedicated to the most important items in there. Now this selector switch is a little confusing. I call it the opposite focus button. We see an AF and an MF, and when the lever is selected to this position, this little button is going to do the opposite of whatever we have our shutter button to do focus-wise. Let's say we have our camera and main shutter button set up to do autofocus, and for whatever reason we need to dial in precise manual focus. When the lever is pointed to AF, MF, pushing and holding this little button will do the opposite. So in this case, manual focus, and then we can dial it in precisely. If the camera is in manual focus, pushing and holding this button will tell the camera to use autofocus. So just keep this in mind. It's going to do the opposite focus-wise of whatever your halfway shutter depression is going to do. I wouldn't worry about using it too much until you have your basic controls such as exposure and basic focusing down first. If we flip the switch down, this button now becomes the auto exposure lock button, which freezes our exposure settings as long as we hold it down. You will notice we also have a magnifying glass, which means that in a playback mode, this is going to allow us to zoom in and out. Next, we have the FN, or the function button, which in a shooting mode will allow us to pull up a mini menu. This menu can be customized so we can determine which items appear. You will also notice this is a send to smartphone button. Just below the primary selector, we have the video record button, and you're going to press this every time you want to record video. On the right side of the viewfinder, we have the diopter adjustment. It's very easy to miss. This allows us to change the electrical viewfinder focus if we wear glasses or contacts. On the left side of the camera, under a small door, we have our ports. Going from top to bottom, they are: the micro USB port is going to allow us to connect our camera to a computer using the cable that came with it, or to power our camera, or to charge our battery as it rests inside of the camera housing. I really recommend getting an external charger. I'm a little bummed it didn't come with one, but I would strongly suggest getting an external one so you can charge your batteries and still use your camera. Next is the mini HDMI out port, and this is going to allow us to send a video to a recorder or an external monitor. Below that, we have our microphone jack, which will allow us to feed an external microphone into the camera, very important for good audio. As you probably already know, the monitor can tilt up and down, and beneath the camera on the right side, you have your battery and SD card slot. Notice the icon with the edged corner that tells you the correct orientation of the SD card. Gently pushing it all the way until we hear a click tells us it is correctly in position. Gently pushing into the camera a second time until we hear another click releases it from the slot. So that is an overview of the camera's external buttons and ports, with an introduction of their names and a short summary of what they do. If you ever forget which button does what, just come on back and we'll go over it again. For the rest of the video, we are going to discuss each of these buttons in depth, as well as how to use them in real-life shooting situations. If you found this video helpful, you might be interested in my Sony A6300 crash course. I'll teach you the basics and show you how to shoot like a pro in no time. You can order it from the following link.